I'm
4,
Dan.
3.
Well, it's good. I got a notification that our show's live, at least. Things seem to be working better. Welcome to American Party Podcast today. Alongside me, Dan Holloway, your host. We have Nick Gillespie, who is the host of Reason Podcast. And you are the editor.
The Reason Interview.
Excuse me. Yeah, Reason
podcast,
Interview podcast.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And you were the editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine for quite a while as well.
I was the editor-in-chief of Reason, the print magazine from 2000 to 2008, the website and the video platform from 2008 to 2018, and now I'm an editor-at-large, so I make content rather than curate it.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your background. How did you get into all this? What's your education? Where'd you come from?
Okay, so I'm speaking to you from Manhattan. I was born in Brooklyn, a very small child. Grew up mostly in New Jersey, and God, I don't, when you say where did I come from? Fuck, it's like I wonder about that every day. But I went to Rutgers College. I was an English and psychology major. I worked for a bunch of newspapers and teen magazines and music magazines and movie magazines in New York. Before going back to grad school, I've got a master's in English and creative writing from Temple University in Philly and a PhD in American literature from SUNY Buffalo. And I started at Reason in 1993. I became a libertarian partly by hanging around with a lot of teen stars and a lot of rock stars. Like, you realize you want these people to have as much freedom as possible, but you don't want them to have any control over your life, just like politicians. I, as a cub reporter for a bunch of newspapers in New Jersey, I went to planning board meetings and zoning board meetings and really, learned that, the local tyranny that is local government for the most part. And that definitely helped me become a libertarian, as well as reading Reason Magazine, which I've been doing since high school. My brother discovered it at college and sent it home to me. And then I joined Reason in 1993 and was happy to escape Buffalo's weather. It's based in LA, although most of our people now are in DC, and I live in New York. So I don't know if that brings us up to date, but that's kind of who I am.
Well, yeah, I want to talk more about the libertarian thing, because I think libertarian it seems to be something of a catch-all these days for people who are just disenfranchised from two-party politics. And I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I have conversations with a lot of people about this, and I feel like a lot of them don't really understand the ethos of libertarianism very well.
I have come over the years to define it increasingly not as a kind of set of, fixed principles even, or policy prescriptions. Like, here are 10 libertarian takes, and if you don't agree with, 10 out of 10, or you only agree with 8 out of 10, get the fuck out, you're not libertarian. Although I would, there are definite libertarian policy positions, but I've been defining more and more as an adjective or as a direction, as a temperament. And basically the way I see it is libertarianism, or being libertarian, is about wanting a smaller government, not simply to have a smaller government, but to give more people more control over the choices in their lives. And, I'm not an anarchist. I believe in a limited government. It should be much more limited than it is today, and it should be much smaller at every level and just geared towards helping people that can't help themselves and protecting people, protecting their rights and their bodily integrity. So I see it as a direction. Are we going more to a space where people have more meaningful choices and ability to act on those in their life, or less? Other people will define it elsewise. But, what that comes down to practically is I'm pro, I want more immigration rather than less immigration. I think more people should be allowed to come here and live legally and work legally. I think drugs should be legalized because the harms of the black market are so intense that they totally overwhelm any possible benefits from prohibition, including, things like, we need criminal justice reform. I believe I'm a free speech maximalist. I believe in school choice, things like this. I want to live in a world where the economy and the cultural sphere are as deregulated as possible, not so that people don't have don't belong to communities or something, but that they get to pick where they go. For me, the model in a lot of things is kind of the way we deal with religion, where it's not mandatory and you can affiliate with whatever church you want. And that means we have a lot of different churches. People are coming and going. They're creating new ones. Old ones are dying out. Like, that's basically every part of life should be like that.
Yeah, it's. If you say things like that without attaching any kind of label to it, you'll see a lot of people nodding their heads, and then you say, "I'm a libertarian." They're like, "Oh, what's that mean?"
Oh, yeah.
Well, I just fucking told you what it means. You know what I mean?
But it's also, there's like weird, attachments that kind of get stuck on the libertarian label and things like that. So,
I mean, it's like anarcho-capitalists get lumped in with libertarians a lot, and it's just not a very. I mean, I guess to some degree they're more closely related than neocons and neoliberals.
Yeah, I think so.
But
I'm not an anarcho or an ANCAP, but a lot of my friends are, and I think there's a lot of really good ideas there and things like that. I fully believe, because I believe in technological innovation and improvement. I think I'm going to live to be 100, maybe 200, but no matter how long I live, I don't have enough time to kind of keep reiterating the foundations of everything, which anarcho-capitalists are constantly doing. Like we are thrown into the world, we have a certain amount of time here, and it's like, I just want to make sure we're going in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's I think the most, I tweeted this the other day, I think the most honorable thing that any patriot can do is leave America better than they found it. And it's hard to do that without some kind of organized effort. I wonder, from your perspective, as somebody that's been a libertarian for decades now, it seems to me one of the biggest challenges is to wrangle people, to organize a bunch of people who mostly just want to be left alone. You know what I mean? It's like that's got to be a challenge in some way.
Yeah, but it's also true that one of the slams on libertarians is that they're selfish, egotistical, self-centered, in a profound way. And I actually have found that, like, libertarians, maybe even more than most people, it's like they want to be free from coercive, power, not so that they never have to deal with other people, but so that they can create the communities and the companies, the families, the societies that they want to belong in, that are kind of opt-in rather than, mandated. So there have been, over the almost 30 years I've been at Reason, there have been a ton of libertarian shifts, broadly speaking, in American culture that generally don't get identified as libertarian or acknowledged as such. But I would, when you look at free speech, we're in the middle of an interesting period where, there is wokeism in the private sector and in the public sector that is, dangerous and growing. But I think it's overwhelmingly dwarfed by the rise in all forms of new technology, including, the stuff we're talking through, where you can say and publish and produce whatever you want, and you can find an audience for it in a way that 50 years ago was virtually impossible. That's great. I think, individualism comes and goes, but, the state now, I think, has to deal with people more as individuals than it did 50 years ago. I think that's good. When I see, free trade has taken a beating over the past couple of years, but, in 1970 or whatever, 72, let's say 40 years ago or 50 years ago, I don't, whatever. Yeah, I guess it's 50 years ago. Free trade was not taken that seriously by the most powerful people on the planet. It's much more taken for granted. It's under attack. I think, immigration is generally seen as a good thing. Again, these things are all, being battled at any given moment, but, like, in many, many profound ways, the the world is more libertarian. People have more options to live however they want, and people generally are more comfortable with that. I do think, the current moment we're going through a phase where this stuff is coming under attack from both the traditional right and the left. So this is a particular moment where libertarians need to be front and center, and we'll see if we rise to the challenge.
Yeah, it's that's certainly true. I mean, it seems to me like let's talk about the immigration thing. This is something that I deal with on a regular basis. Having conversations that tiptoe outside of party line talking points with some people seems to be increasingly more difficult. I think it's just intellectual laziness, really. It's so much easier to monolith everything. Like all immigration's bad. Like, well, not really. I mean, cyclical migrant labor is a massive boon for the American economy. We get labor that is extremely cheap, keeping products cheap, and those folks make that money and then go back to their communities in other countries where that dollar goes a lot farther than it would here. So we're not taking advantage of them. You know what I mean? They're making a lot of money for their location, and we're getting cheap products for our location. That seems like a good deal for us. But you see less and less of that point being made from the left, from the pro-immigration side, if you want to call them that.
Because
that's not their intent.
People are being exploited. And so, we want more people to be coming here, but under certain circumstances that we kind of control and direct. And that's problematic. I mean, immigration for me is, probably like one of I write about a lot of stuff or, bloviate about a lot of stuff. Immigration is extremely, near the very top of the list. All of my grandparents were uneducated, unskilled, trash from Europe. My grandparents came from Ireland on my father's side and Italy on my mother's side. And they were exactly the type of people. They came in the 19-teens. If they had tried to come 10 years later, they wouldn't have been able to get into the country because of restrictions placed on immigration in the early 1920s. And, they are archetypal, people from shithole, people from shithole countries. Ireland and Italy were like third world countries when they came over, and they had no real skills. And they showed up here and they did pretty well. They produced a generation of kids, which is not a good thing, but who fought in World War II and then, became middle class after World War II. And we need more people like that, not fewer. I find on the left, as you were saying, there's this weird kind of embrace of immigrants as long as we get to kind of control their comings and goings. And their labor patterns. And then, on the right, there has been this rise of, the conservatives and Republicans for most of the post-war era. And certainly like Ronald Reagan was, objectively pro-immigrant. In the past 20 or 30 years, the right has become so hostile to immigrants from places like Mexico and China. It's deeply disturbing because a lot of these people, like I know a lot of people at National Review and at other conservative publications, many of whom have names, last names that end in vowels or are suspiciously Irish sounding, and they're anti-immigrant. And it's like, come on, like if it was good for your grandparents or your great grandparents or your parents, it's probably good for now too. People will say, and increasingly a number of libertarians are like this. They feel, the existence of a welfare state means you can't have immigration. Or pretty loose immigration, and that's wrong. Like build a wall around the welfare state, not around immigrants, most of whom can't access welfare anyway, and to the extent that they do, they take advantage of it much less than native-born people.
Sure.
You're in Texas, right? You're in Austin.
Yeah, that's right.
Think about it. Like Texas, where I've lived, I did a 2-year hitch in Huntsville, Texas, not in the prison, but in the town, which. To be quite honest, it's kind of a blurry line between being in the Walls unit and just walking around downtown Huntsville. But Texas is benefiting from massive migration from places like New York and California and Illinois, and that works on the national level too. It creates some difficulties and adjustments and things like that. But the free movement of people is kind of a great thing, and people go to places where life is better and has more options. I lived for a long time. I lived in a small town in southwestern Ohio, which had no immigration. And Ohio actually has out migration. And it's like there I realized, after living in various types of, various different places in the country, the places that have a lot of immigration are always doing pretty well. And it's the places that don't have a lot of immigration. I said I went to grad school in Buffalo. Buffalo needs migrants, whether they're from the US or Canada or from, Antarctica. And it's inevitably, it's the places with low immigration that are doing the worst.
But there has to be, I mean, even someone that recognizes the benefits of migratory labor or migration in general, there has to be some kind of security in today's age, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, this is, one of the, and I get accused of this a lot of, just being an open borders person. And that conjures up the idea that we would just have nothing anywhere, no checkpoints anywhere around the perimeter of the country, or, more realistically, most illegal immigrants enter the country legally. I think it's a majority of them come in through, certainly legally, but oftentimes through airports and things like that, where you're not thinking about it. But it's not, no, the whole point is that what you do is you check people as they're coming across the border. And as long as they don't have, say, a violent, criminal past, you vet them for that, and whether or not they have communicable diseases that are, a threat, let them in, let them live openly. That means that, they can't get welfare for, the first several years. They can work, but then they pay taxes. It's like the whole idea of illegal immigration, creating a black market in immigration brings about the same black market problems you see when you're talking about drugs. It doesn't get rid of the supply, but it just makes it more dangerous for everybody, including bystanders. Like the best thing we could do, if there's 1 million people who want to come here, but aren't allowed because we have insane bureaucratic, restrictive immigration laws, let them come across the border. We know who they are. They're paying taxes. They're not getting anything out of us. Man, that's like a win. And as you were saying, part of it, some of these people, if they're here for particular seasons, like if they're migrant, farm workers or something like that, they come here for a while and then they go back, and they actually create more stability in their home countries. Yep. My Italian grandfather used to go from Italy in the early 1900s. He would go to Argentina for a while and work there and come back. He would go to the US and work. And then World War I came, and his father said to him and his brothers, you got to pick a country, either Argentina or the US, and go there for good, because otherwise you're just going to be, wiped out as a draftee in World War I. And my grandfather was the stupid one. He came to the US. At the time, Argentina was a wealthy country and was more welcoming to Italians. But it's like, we win. We win. If people who want to come here to work and live and, start something, we win if they're here, and all we have to do is make it easier for them to be visible. Everybody wins.
Well, we're the first country in history to organize ourselves around ideas instead of the way people look.
And we did kind of a shitty job of that.
We did a horrible job. Yeah.
But having said that, exactly. And, this is one of the things I think we're, more broadly, we're in a moment, and have been for a good chunk of the 20th century. But, after 9/11, after the financial crisis, after Trump to some degree, certainly after COVID, the rise of China, we don't feel very confident or secure in ourselves. And as a result, we get, when you're a little bit nervous, you're like, I don't know, we don't want change. And so people say, well, immigrants, particularly now, the two biggest sender countries are China and India. Mexico is the third, but these are different types of people than we normally get en masse. And, we can't withstand that. We're losing our culture, but the genius of America is that its culture is constantly changing. And I gotta say, my Italian grandparents who never spoke English, who lived in an Italian ghetto in Waterbury, Connecticut their entire lives, were pretty good Americans. They worked hard, they raised kids who worked hard. And, when you think of the way that a bunch of Italian culture filtered into America and made it more interesting, certainly very different,
Yeah.
But it's like, hey, you know what? That's pretty good. And like when you look at these monolithic cultures, including a place like Japan, which has fewer people now than it had in 2000, it's getting old. They don't want to admit immigrants because they want to keep things the way they are. Japan is like a dying culture. I don't want America to look like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's, and we have this way, it seems like there's some agency involved each one of these times, whether it's an organization or some kind of movement or one of the political parties that tries to attack pretty much anything like that happens, regardless of if the attack is actually salient to the point. Like there were 2.5, almost 3 million Italians from the late 19th century until the 1920s that came from Italy to the United States. At its height, the mob had about 6,000 made guys, right? And that's all people, like quite a bit of people. We still have not had, to my knowledge, an Italian president, and probably won't for some time, for some odd reason. It makes no sense at all. But that's been the case for a long. There's like these weird prejudices that we talk about, and it's there's actually a good book from the 1950s about this, about how the language that was used during the sugar trade in the early Americas, where it was like, these black people are good workers and all, but be careful because when they come here, they're going to come after your women. You know what I mean? Like there's always some weird narrative drawn by nefarious forces that want to corrupt all of this, or maybe they just want to hold on to power for themselves. I'm not sure what it is. And
it's creepy and it's recurrent.
It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me how easily people fall for that shit. I mean, I guess we are tribalistic at our core, but
and again, I think a lot of it is, a lot of people are scared when the global economy changes, and which means the local economy changes and things like that. And I wrote in my doctoral dissertation, I wrote a lot about The Great Gatsby, which I read as a novel about the shift in America from the countryside to the city. It was real in 1920 was the first census where more people lived in cities than in kind of small towns and around the countryside. And it's a novel where people don't read it this way usually, but there's a ton of immigrants all kind of filtered around the action. And both, Nick Carraway and the people he hangs out with are kind of freaked out by it, because there's Jews and Italians and blacks who have migrated from the South to New York. And it's kind of like, hey, we're WASPs. And what the fuck is going on here? Against that same backdrop is, a change in the economy towards industrialization, et cetera. People freak out. And when you read things from the 20s, which, after 40 years of sustained mass immigration from Europe, and not from like the good parts of Europe, Swedes weren't coming in the same numbers they used to, and British people, it was all like Italians and Greeks and Jews and, some Irish left over, things of Poles, people freaked out. And, we need to have the cultural confidence that what America does, and I think this is brilliant. I think it's the genius of the country is that it comes, it lets people come here, and America changes a little bit, and those people change too, because like you were saying earlier, America is about ideas, and it's really about kind of self-determination. It's about individualism, not so that you can live alone in your castle somewhere, but so that you can create the towns and the businesses and the families, that you want. And, like we need to really, be confident in that we can withstand. We take the wretched of the world, the wretched refuse of the world, and we turn them into a fantastic country where people have more options to live however they want.
Right.
I think that's great.
Yeah, I agree. Let me ask you this. It's very clear what the libertarian position on socialism is, but corporatism is something that's becoming a much bigger problem these days. I think socialism is kind of a fucking joke to me.
I agree.
Corporatism, though, is something that's it's quickly becoming more rampant. I guess it's been since the Industrial Revolution. It's part of it, right? Because the barrier to entry for large expensive equipment is
Right.
always going to be there. So you have to be rich to get started in the first place, or lucky.
Yeah.
How do you balance, as a libertarian, like what Mitt Romney said, corporations are people? I mean,
Right.
that can't be where the operating premise here.
Well,
So,
and like, I think people struggle for the word that captures, the fears and the anxieties. Crony capitalism gets used a lot, and I think that gets to a big part of it. There's this idea that big business and big government are kind of like natural enemies, but they're actually natural allies. And we see this again and again at the turn of the century into the 20th century. The railroads were giant businesses. There were these incredible trusts. And there was this story that progressive historians told, and a lot of people tell because it's kind of a happy story, and politicians did that. Strong, forward-looking progressive politicians reined in the railroads, to benefit the little guy. And so that's why you need a strong government to protect you against the depredations of big business.
right.
And a bunch of historians, including a guy named Gabriel Kolko, who was a socialist historian, went back and looked at that era. This was in the late 60s and 70s. And it was like, that's completely wrong. It was the railroads that were calling for regulation because they had reached a point where their profits were starting to decline. So they wanted to lock in the market, with them in the positions they were in. And that happens again and again. And this is an actual problem with capitalism, particularly in the context of the way we do government. Big businesses get big and then they almost immediately sue the government for peace. And they say, hey, you know what, like competition is messy and, things are going good now. So let's regulate this market. So, we'll help you write those regulations and we're going to lock in things because everything is good now.
Yeah.
Examples of that in the current day include companies like Facebook,
Right.
which a couple of years ago, and the government was starting to say, hey, we got to regulate these guys. And Mark Zuckerberg, went to in front of Congress. He said, we need to be regulated. You're right. We're going to have to help you write those regulations because we know our business better than you. And after the regulations, there won't be another Facebook, but we'll feel good, like all of the people in this room. And, that's happening. Lyft and Uber are examples of that. Uber, was a kind of quintessential disruptive technology and company, which has brought great things to the world, especially if you lived in a city that didn't have a lot of cabs, which is most cities outside of New York and a couple of other places.
I mean, even with the cabs, because that was a horrible industry, I guess, to be in.
But what they would do is, they would come into cities or areas and markets, and then they would build up a base. And then they did this in DC and in Northern Virginia, where they came in, without permission, which is kind of great. And I like that they built up a market. And then they went to they went to DC's city government and Northern Virginia, and they said like, hey, you know what, we agree with you. It's, it would be very disruptive if there were constant new entries into ride sharing. Why don't we come to an agreement where, cars have to be of a certain type and you have to pass certain safety things, et cetera. And lo and behold, a business gets big and then it petitions the government to lock in its markets. I think that's a lot of what's going on today, especially because, one of the hallmarks of capitalism, Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, talked about creative destruction. Businesses and kind of, the economy and even, social and cultural institutions are constantly changing. And, if you are at the top of the pyramid, you want to preserve the pyramid. So we're getting more and more of that. And what disturbs me really over the past, I'd say maybe 20 years, certainly over the past 5 years, is at least rhetorically, Republicans would say, we're for free markets. We don't want the government picking winners and losers. That's gone out the window now. And they're like, yes, the government should pick winners and losers, and we'll pick them because we want to be the government.
Right. Yeah.
And so you don't, only libertarians and weirdly some progressives push back on the idea that crony capitalism is a good thing.
Yeah,
but I think people are pissed at it.
It depends on the issue. Libertarians pretty much always progressives when unless it's something that's forcing somebody else to do something that they want them to do, then it's fine.
It's same thing with speech. I mean, and I'm proud to call myself libertarian And, it's like libertarians are, at their best. I mean, we might be kind of hard-headed, but we're very consistent. And so, free speech isn't just something that's good when I need it. It's good for everybody, even if I hate what they're fucking saying.
Right.
And it's the same thing with like markets. Markets are good even when your market share is going to zero.
Sure, yeah. I mean, a right it only exists if it exists for everybody.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's a privilege given to a chosen few, right?
Right.
And locking out new competition, it's like the person who climbs the ladder and then pulls the ladder up with them.
Yep.
We have no,
which happens with immigration.
Yeah,
right?
a lot, quite a bit. First generation Americans are some of the most anti-immigration people I've ever met.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's anytime you unnaturally rise barriers to entry or create competition vacuums, it freezes us in time, and it disallows us from the flexibility and ingenuity that made this country great.
Yep.
And that's cancer. I mean, what happens when we need to do something. Innovation is the only solution, and our only option left at this point is the Defense Production Act, I guess. I mean, that seems like a big fucking problem, because nobody that can hear the sound of my voice trusts government. I can't imagine that they do. It depends. They routinely will delude themselves if somebody they like is saying something they like, but otherwise they don't like the government. Most people don't. And leaving the running of your country or community to politicians and corporations is the equivalent of invoking a self-imposed caste system. Like, you've given them control over you, and the founders, as flawed as they were, particularly on race and shit like that, but as flawed as they were on some of this stuff, they were pretty clear about of, for, and by the people, right? Mm-hmm. If you want a government that's of, for, and by the people, you have to take charge of your government. You know what I mean? You have to be an active participant in it from the lowest possible level, all the way up to the federal level. And that leads me to my next question. How does libertarianism work at the federal level? Like, how do you compete against neoliberals who have been, I mean, the liberals in general have been expanding government forever, but now their counterpart, neocons, have presided over the largest expansion of the federal government in history. Right. They've broadened the surveillance state, all this stuff. And that's, I don't know what libertarians did in the last federal election, but I'm guessing like maybe 11%. Something like that.
You're now it was closer to 1%. It was a little bit over like 1.4%. I think the LP, the Libertarian Party is part of the libertarian movement, but it's, it doesn't have a lot of success in terms of electoral things. And I think, the way that libertarians can affect either politics or policy is at a broader kind of cultural or almost pre-political level. We definitely, when you talk about the expansion of the federal government, it is unbelievable, not adjusting for inflation, but the last budget that Bill Clinton signed in 2000, for the fiscal year 2000, was slightly under $2 trillion. We, in 2021, we spent $6.8 trillion. And between 2019, the federal budget was $4.4 trillion. So there was a 50% increase between 2019 and 2021. This is partly Trump, partly Biden. I mean, this, we are not just expanding the government. It's like almost kind of geometrically, it's like a doubling or tripling cube thing going on. And, I think you're right also. And I see this as a big win for libertarian thinking, but it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory. But one of the things that libertarians have convinced most people of is that the government is not particularly good at what it does. People don't have, compared to 50 years ago, people have much lower levels of trust and confidence in the government at any level to either be competent or efficacious or honest. And I know for a long time, I thought that was a precondition for people saying, okay, so I want less government. As it turns out, and this makes things really complicated, across the globe, when political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists look at high trust societies that move into low trust societies, which is what's happening in the United States. People don't say, okay, get the government out of my life. They are in a state of panic and they vote for more and more government, even knowing the government is, incompetent or, kind of criminal or something, because they want some semblance of order. And I think that explains what's been going on. So I've been saying to libertarians for a while at Reason a couple of years ago, I wrote a story about this. Our message might have to change from saying the government is always bad. Ronald Reagan said, the government isn't the solution to your problems. It is your problem, or it is the problem. A very libertarian message, which has effectively won, but that's a recipe for growing government. I think what we need to be doing is kind of reframing what government is for and and making the sale that government should be involved in many fewer parts of our lives at all levels, but including the federal government. The federal government should be spending much less and doing much less, and it should be limited to things like defense. And by that, I don't mean, wars of choice all over the world and dropping, endless amounts of bombs in places people don't even know about, or having troops, in every country in the world. It's, we should be defending ourselves. We should be, the federal government should be helping people who cannot help themselves, but it should be spending much less than it does, so that what it does focus on, it can be a little bit more competent. And all federal programs that give money to people, first off, it should only go to people who actually need it. And it should be in the form of unrestricted cash grants, because individuals know best how to improve their lives. And like, I've known tons of people personally who are like, they have a car, they have a kind of a shitty job, but they're working it because they'll get skills and move on to the next one. They have a car that breaks down. They could get welfare, for housing support, for Medicaid, to get health care, for food stamps. But, what they can't get is like the $200 they need to fix their car so they can keep going to work.
Right.
They lose their job, they go on welfare. They get disability to explain why they're not working, et cetera. If we had a government, that helped people, hit their basic needs when they needed it.
Well, like you mentioned Sweden, their unemployment insurance program, I guess we want to call it that, is vastly different, and all of Northern Europe is, by the way, vastly different. Not necessarily Eastern. The farther east in Europe you go, the worse things get, obviously. But in Northern Europe, the Swedish government feels like it is their duty to get you back on the right path, right? So there's no 48 or 50 weeks of unemployment insurance, and then you just have to go do 3 job interviews a week, and you get your money, no questions asked. No, they do like a full assessment. All right, you got laid off for this reason. Maybe that industry is dying, so we need to retrain you in a new industry. And the government retrains you in that industry and then helps you get a job there. And there's no limit on it. It could take 3 weeks. It could take a year, right? And I think conservatives would probably bitch about that it's open-ended. But when have penalties affected crime or people taking advantage of systems? It doesn't work. Like all the research we've done on from low level drug crime all the way up to murder, like the death penalty has literally no effect on whether or not people murder. There's zero correlation between those two things. So it seems like I've mentioned this on the show before. There's a Christian writer back in the day, James Dobson, who wrote in a book about parenting that the more frequently you catch your kids doing the right thing, the less you'll catch them doing the wrong thing. And I think positive motivation is a big thing for people. One of the users here in YouTube says, how does the Libertarian Party change from the party of I told you so to the party of solutions, right? That's got to be the next big step, right? Yeah.
Well, so Reason Magazine is published by a nonprofit, Reason Foundation. They have a policy shop where they actually propose, kind of limited government solutions to things that are kind of like the architecture of what's going on. So they've come up with ways, and they've implemented these in a bunch of cities and states, for instance, for fixing public pension plans, which, increasingly, and these are the types of things that are important. This is the kind of scaffolding or the framework of everyday life that is kind of invisible unless you're looking for it. But in a lot of states and a lot of cities, Chicago comes to mind, the pension liabilities are so incredible. They are sucking more and more energy out of the economy and out of taxpayers' wallets. Social Security and Medicare, which are universal programs that go to people regardless of need, are taking up more and more of the federal budget. Like, how do you fix those? And, so Reason Foundation has come up with things like that. They've come up with great programs for increasing school choice. Giving, if you give the money directly to the parents or the student, and the parents as a proxy, and let them spend the federal dollars, the state dollars, and the local dollars on whatever school they want, kind of like Pell Grants in college, you would change the way public education functions. It would get leaner but more effective. And most importantly, it would actually reflect the values and mores of the people who are going to it. I love Corey
DeAngelis.
Who was at Reason for a long time. He's now at a different organization. But this idea of backpack funding. But like when you start to think about that, of like, how do you devolve decision making to the individual, as a matter of right, and then how do you help people who don't have the resources to actually opt in? Something like school choice. Middle class people, certainly upper middle class people, and rich people have tons of school choice. But it's kind of people at the lower end where education could really make a difference in their kids' lives. They have the least number of options. That we can fix that and address that.
We could fix it. That's one of those things that doesn't require a huge, like a huge shift. Even just passing federal school choice, where the money follows the kid, would solve that problem within a couple of years.
Yeah, and it's, Corey talks about how, certainly at the federal level, and this is a place where Donald Trump, I'm not a Trump fan, but he was very good on school choice. As it happens, the federal government isn't really the place where school policy gets made. That's really made at the state and local level. But Corey talks a lot about how, like, going to state capitals and, lobbying for backpack funding laws where the dollars follow the student rather than go to the building that you then force the student to attend against their will. You can do that, pretty effectively. There's a lot of things like that. When it comes to things like drug legalization, part of it is the idea, if you give people more choice, you at the end of the day, drug legalization is about giving people their choice of intoxicant or not to imbibe at all. Which I think is a moral good, and I think it's philosophically, it makes a lot of sense. Really, I don't think anybody should be in jail because they prefer cocaine to gin or something. But more to the point, when you give more people more choices, it has all of these knock-on effects where suddenly police are not spending a lot of their time doing stupid drug war shit, and instead they can focus on actual property crime and violent crime. It doesn't clog up the courts and the prisons with a lot of relatively nonviolent offenders who are, who might even be kind of businessmen, like drug dealers. Some of them are, they're mostly entrepreneurs. If you're in a black market, violence ends up showing up because that's how you enforce contracts and transactions, but it doesn't have to be that way. But again, the push, the way libertarians, I think, can change the conversation at every level of government is by saying, how do we help individuals actualize their lives? And then more broadly, I write a lot about this, about federal budgets and debt and national debt, and getting out the message that, large national debt, and deficits and increasing with no possibility of slowing that down, it clearly has a depressive effect on the economy. It slows down economic growth. And that's a bad thing because economic growth is the best way to improve everybody's standard of living. And, making that argument and pitching it, to younger people, America does pretty well by people who are over 65. We have been for decades now been screwing people under 40 by making them pay relatively high taxes on payroll taxes and other things to pay for the benefits of relatively rich people. And, we got to stoke that outrage and change our entitlements. I'm 58, almost 59. I'm doing well. Like, nobody should be paying for my health care, my education, my retirement if I can do that. And I would gladly give all of that up. And, if it would reduce the regulatory and tax burden on younger people who I was young, I didn't have any money when I was young, and I could have used, relief from entitlement programs that I'm never really going to fully participate in anyway.
How much of that do you think is mission creep, just standard bureaucratic bloat that happens over time, and the axis of bureaucracy and trying to maintain power over other people?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mix, I think, of mission creep and kind of natural bureaucratic tendencies. Jefferson has a quote about how it's the natural tendency for government to grow and liberty to yield, or something along those lines. I think part of it is ideological as well, because again, both right wingers and left wingers in America, they have different language, but when's the last time you heard a Republican say, you know what we got to do? We got to get rid of entitlements for old people. We should have a safety net to help people. But like old people, if you're a millionaire, pay for your own retirement.
Yeah.
They don't do that. And then left wingers or, liberals and Democrats have a reason why everybody else should be getting more. And it's never like, okay, let's take it. They'll say, okay, well, we'll take it from a couple of billionaires, but that's just not realistic. They're always adding to the categories of people who should be getting more from the government.
First they came for the socialists, right? I mean, we're living this shit.
Yeah. And it's just like, you can't, we know all of these entitlement programs are at a point where there are so many takers and so few givers in terms of funding. Mathematically, they are impossible, and they are a drag on everybody's life. Give poor old people, help them survive, in old age, but don't help, and it drives me nuts when people talk about a universal basic income. I think there's a difference between that, which is a bad idea. There's no reason why, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg should be getting, $1,500 a month forever.
Right.
But you can have a minimum, basic income or something, maybe. That would be a much leaner program directed at people who need it. And that way the government doesn't need as much money, and people, are working more for themselves and have more flexibility in how they're living their lives.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so if you're in a leadership position, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but there's something called span of control, and it means that you can only manage 3 to 5 people or entities or whatever it is at one time. So what do? You train those 3 to 5 people to train 3 to 5 more each, and so on and so forth. It's not multi-level marketing, so don't get me confused here.
No, but I understand what you mean.
But that's how you do it, and in my opinion, it's why there's no fixed system of government that will ever scale, right? Without authoritarianism, it's required at some point, and I think we've hit that point. Maybe it is some confluence of the population size and attitude, but 350 million or so people with disparate opinions on things living across a large continent, or a large country rather, clearly not working, right?
Yeah. And the main function of government, I think, and this is an ideological or philosophical point, but it is not to make everybody's life perfect. It is to kind of create a system where you were talking about, 350 million people, or however many people are, who have different wants and desires and objectives in their life. How do you create a system that allows them to kind of get along peacefully? And then, on top of that, I think there is a moral imperative to help people who, for various reasons, can't help themselves.
But without self-determinism, it all breaks down, right? I mean, that kind of defeats the purpose.
But, the point of government, and I think we've gotten away from this, is to create a framework so that we can get on with our lives, and where politics, and this is where I'm not an anarchist. I think there are parts of our lives that are going to be, where politics, where a consensus has to come into play, and 51% of the population gets to set the terms. But that part of our lives should be as small as possible, because it is, by definition, it's zero sum. There are winners and losers, and that 51% typically acts very poorly towards the people that it can rule over. You want that part of your life to be as small as possible, because everything else, in our business lives, in our cultural lives, in our personal lives, that's where the energy is and should be. And we need to free up as much of our time and our resources to pursue, the kind of company we want to work at, or the kind of job we want to have, the kind of, books and music and art we want to make or consume, the churches that we want to belong to, the people that we want to start families and communities with, free that up.
That's what I meant before when I said that not taking control of your communities and even the political process is invoking a self-imposed caste system on yourself and your family. I mean, we've, for the most part, outside of luck, we've eliminated a great portion of the upward mobility that we spent a lot of time creating through the labor movement in the late 19th century, through the GI Bill and the VA home loan after World War II. We created quite a bit of upward mobility during those two periods of time, and we pretty much eliminated all of it now. You are where you are. You might get lucky and be able to dig yourself out of there, but only if you're lower middle or middle class. If you're lower class, you either get lucky or you're fucked for your whole life.
It's harder, the further you go down the ladder, it's harder to move up, but there's still robust intergenerational mobility, and it could be higher. That's really the point. Part of it is because I write a lot about this, actually, and, like, if you look at people who were born in 1940 or 1960, it was easier for them to move up the income ladder, the class ladder, partly because the country was much poorer. But it's true, like when you think about things like education and when you think about housing, could be a lot cheaper if we got rid of, many of the regulatory barriers that just make things more expensive for no good reason other than to help the status quo. Like, existing homeowners have a kind of vested interest in there not being any more homes. Like if you're in the supply, why would you increase the supply necessarily? And we have to get back to, a recognition of what's going on and how to open things up, how to exert less control over people throughout the system, and instead give them more control.
Right. So speaking of exerting less control over the system, I guess maybe this is an example that Chesa Boudin, however you say his stupid fucking name, he's been thoroughly rebuked now by even the most liberal city in the world. And when you look at the crosstabs, when you look at the exit polling, the largely Chinese immigrant communities who have been the victims of quite a bit of violence voted against him more than any other community, I believe. As a matter of fact, every minority-dominant community inside of San Francisco, except for the Mission District, I believe, voted pretty heavily against him, like 60 to 30-ish range. From the libertarian perspective, I know that we don't want over-policing. We don't want, certainly not the drug war, which you mentioned before. The mass incarceration thing, and then the secondary effect of that, which is a bunch of fatherless homes that have led to just sprees and violence recently. What's the libertarian position on how this particular problem should be handled? Like, from a security standpoint, broken window theory is the lowest possible level that government can affect that, right? Obviously, just keeping things nice, property crimes, things like that, lower level crimes, prosecuting that to keep it from escalating. But the war on drugs, as you said, I actually wrote my master's thesis on the closed border policy of the United States and how it's created a professional violent smuggling class. And it's worse now than it's ever been. So I guess maybe I should have written a longer paper. But what's the libertarian position on enforcement in that way?
So I think that the Boudin recall is fascinating, and I think the one thing I know for sure is what people in San Francisco en masse, and again, people who are generally very liberal, were responding to a city that is in obvious decline, and that it's not simply law, but that extends to a lot of it. There are like mass homeless people. There's a sense that social order at its most basic level is broken down. Some of that is, might be the fault of his policies. A lot of it is other kinds of governmental policies that have made San Francisco increasingly expensive to live in. But the services that you get are worse and worse. And I also think, in San Francisco, and we've covered a bunch of this stuff at Reason, you get people who are constantly talking about how it's too expensive to live there, but then they won't allow any new housing. Like they won't increase the supply of housing. And it's like, you are insane. Like if you are holding these two things, independently in your head, like this, it's not going to work, and that's true broadly of California. I've lived in California at various points, most recently for 7 months towards the end of 2020 and the beginning of through the middle of 2021. And it's a state that has, pursued a high tax, high regulation strategy, and it's not delivering on any of the benefits of that anymore. It's, if it's hard to get into a UC school, it's hard to get into a Cal State school. The police, are not doing well. The housing is massively expensive. The state services are terrible. The schools are mediocre at best. So I think Boudin is paying the price for that. There are certain elements of his agenda, like, getting rid of cash bail, which was generally held not to actually reduce crime, but it does punish poor people unfairly, minimizing certain types of crimes. That doesn't seem to have worked. It's like it kind of created a system where some people, professional criminals were taking advantage of relaxed enforcement of very basic laws about shoplifting and things like that. So regardless of the specifics of it, I see it as a wake-up call. If that is happening in, the most, liberal city and the most liberal state in the country, it is a sign that reality is starting to dawn on people. And I think from a libertarian perspective, what you want is not a government, a city government that promises all things to all people and charges you, through the roof for it. It's rather you want a city government that does a few basic things. It keeps the roads clear. It has decent infrastructure. It protects people's rights through police, not over policing, but actual policing. And this may be a turnaround point because California, San Francisco has lost a lot of people because of COVID and because it's in many ways it's unlivable. California has lost people year over year. They lost a congressional seat for the first time. Hopefully we will see, if they're waking up to it, the rest of us can either wake up to it or stop it before it overtakes other parts of the country.
Sure. It looks like George Gascon in LA is going to get recalled as well.
Who had been a mentor to Boudin and had been a DA in San Francisco before. So, that's good. I lived in LA when I was in California, in Venice, and which, had a homeless problem that was out of control and a kind of quality of life issue that was not being attended to by the city government. And it is hard. Like you never want to be in a position where you are just letting the police loose to round up anybody that seems to be homeless or a bit odd. But there is a growing problem of people who are homeless, who are either mentally ill or drug addicted, that are destroying the quality of life for everybody. There needs to be a better system in place to give those people, certainly voluntary access to treatment programs or to better living situations. Because, in Venice, near the beach, there are, people in multi-million-dollar homes who have homeless people sleeping in front of them, defecating all over the place. Like, this is not a system that's going to hold up very well. Part of it is making housing more affordable. Part of it is giving more services to people, who need them. Part of it is enforcing basic everyday, custom of like, it is, it's not acceptable to shit on the streets, Like you can do that in your backyard, but you can't do that in somebody else's front yard.
Right.
And it's not easy to fix any things. And you do always, I think from a libertarian perspective, you always need to be careful about people's rights because a lot of times powerful people invoke hysteria or panic in order just to get rid of things they don't like. So, you need to be careful about that. But I think, the results in San Francisco and also the recall, possibly even more important, of the Board of Education in San Francisco, where, people during COVID, where they were not instructing kids and where they were, arbitrarily opening and closing things, the San Francisco School Board was spending a ton of time talking about renaming schools to get, and again, you saw the Asian American community, particularly the Chinese community there, but other people being like, what the fuck? Like, let's get our priorities in a row, in order here. So I'm happy to see this. The one thing, you never know what comes next. But this seems to be like the beginning of something positive that, we should all be looking at and discussing and figuring out how do we apply kind of the same dynamics and analysis to our more local communities.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've got a lot of friends who were people who followed politics who are now getting pretty deeply involved in it. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Obviously, you want to have as much say in how things are going around you as possible. Otherwise, the system doesn't work, right? I mean, you can imagine yourself in the office, and there's one or two busybodies, and they're the ones that sign up for every meeting and every committee, and you're like, I don't feel like doing that. But if I don't go, that dummy is going to go and make some stupid ass policy that we all have to follow. Well, that's what we've done in America for the last 40 years, basically.
Sure.
Like the idea that Nixon talked about the silent majority. What was that? Fucking 60 years ago when he first mentioned that, or 50 years ago when he first mentioned that?
Yeah, I mean, late 60s, early 70s.
So we're still dealing with the compulsion from people who lean center right to not get involved in politics. Right. Like it just doesn't work that way. And at least not. Yeah. Maybe it never worked. I don't think the founders certainly didn't expect us all to just sit at home and let things happen to us.
Right. I mean, and again, I think part of the thing is, when you think of powerful institutions like local school districts, planning boards and things like that, they very quickly get captured by special interests, and then people kind of live with the consequences, and it's a real responsibility to be part of your community and shaping it. And as a libertarian, I think the best ways that you can do that is by living your life the way you want to, by starting the businesses and the voluntary associations. But you also need to be working to create an architecture that empowers individuals and decentralizes power and decision making, because that's, to me, is the biggest problem. And so, thinking about something like school choice, if you create a system of school choice, and you have to do that by engaging with education policy, either at the state or the local level, you make it easier for everybody to kind of find their own way. And, that's a better way of doing politics than trying to take over something and then forcing your singular vision of the world on everybody around you.
Yeah, sure, certainly. It's the returning power back to people, which was the point in the first place. I really enjoy when Corey, people will say, politicians and bots on Twitter will say, if school choice passes, then you're effectively defunding public education. And he will just rhetorically ask, well, why? Why would that happen? And obviously the point is, it would only defund public education if public education fucking sucks.
Right. Or, well, it defunds, public school buildings, but not the education. The education is something that's determined by the student, right, or the parents. So it's a different funding mechanism for sure, and it sucks money out of dead buildings that in places like Los Angeles has spent billions of dollars on school buildings, even as their enrollments decline. Why would you do that? These are pyramids for dead pharaohs. And the point is, like, you should be funding the kids who can find education all over the place. Just as you have storefront churches, you could have storefront schools that people get a lot of value out of and actually want to go to. There was a great libertarian newspaper guy who ran what became the Orange County Register. He was named R.C. Hoyles, and when he was running the Orange County Register, the Santa Ana Register at the time, it was the only newspaper on the West Coast that editorialized against the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. But he was fond of saying, the only difference between whorehouses and public schools is that people have to be forced to go to public schools, or the main difference. And it's like, that right there, that tells you that something is really, really wrong, and we can address these things. But again, I think the overriding principle or idea is like, how do you return more meaningful decision making to individuals?
Sure. Yeah.
You know, and give them more space to experiment. You know, a model, as long as we're psychically in California, you know, a model is Burning Man, where, you know, people go and they do weird, crazy stuff, and, you know, and they clean up after themselves. That's like, you know, that's, you know, that might not scale up, but it's kind of an interesting way to think about how we might govern ourselves, especially when we're reaching a point where government is broke and we're never going to be able to pay for all of its promises. So let's, you know, reset the slate of what it does and how we interact with it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's the Boy Scouts. Leave it better than how you found it. And just from, you know, one more warning. I warn this audience a lot to get involved, box the government out in any chance you get. If there's a problem in the community, solve it. I mean, think about the people that run for political office. They're basically the hall monitors who volunteered for it in grade school. Is that you want a bunch of those people telling you what to do all the time? Right. It doesn't make sense. Let me ask you one last question before we get out of here. And this is a big one for libertarian folk, and one that I think is a bit nuanced. Under what circumstances should America get involved in foreign conflicts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, you know, generally my immediate answer is we should be militarily involved, you know, boots on the ground when America or its very specific interests or people are being attacked. So, you know, in general, I'm not an isolationist, but I am a non-interventionist. And, to put a little bit of meat on those bones, you know, I think we had a right, a responsibility even to go after bin Laden in Afghanistan when we knew he was there and the government there refused to hand him over or help us. You know, we were legitimate to go into the country. We were not legitimate to stay there for 20 years and kind of waste our resources and our people and do massive destruction to that country for no clear aim, right? I mean, realistically, that was such a folly. Iraq isn't even worth talking about. It was a complete non sequitur in going after bin Laden and the other people responsible for 9/11. And so I think we should be militarily involved in many, many fewer conflicts than we have been or will be. The main thing that what America should be doing is always be open to people who are leaving war zones. Not only did we go into Afghanistan and then fuck it up for 20 years, we are now being really cheap and chintzy and like letting people who helped us there come into the United States. I mean, this is so morally repugnant. I'm beside myself on that type of thing.
I mean, it's the same thing we did to them in the 80s, right? We helped them defeat the Russians, and we created a monster there, and then we left and let the monster take over.
I mean, the truth of, most interventions is that, whatever seems good at the time ends up creating the next thing that we're fighting. And certainly you see that we funded the Mujahideen because they were fighting back against the Soviets. And the Soviet Union had no right to invade Afghanistan. That was a bad thing, but not every fight is our fight. With something like Ukraine, it worries me that we are inching our way into, full-fledged engagement there. And if we're being realistic, the U.S. foreign policy should be about defending American interests and honoring our obligations. We don't technically have any strict obligations with Ukraine. I think this is something that the countries surrounding it, Germany, France, Poland, Italy, other large, powerful countries in Europe have stepped up, and we should continue to support them to do that. But we shouldn't be involved there. That's not our fight.
Yeah, I agree with that.
If the past 20 years of foreign policy has taught people anything, it's that war is not a particularly easy or quick way to solve anything. I think that's one of the big libertarian wins over the past 2 decades. People are much more averse to war than they were. We shouldn't have lost as many lives and killed as many people in foreign countries as we did to learn that lesson. But it's good. And we should also, though, not mistake not being ready to drop bombs and troops on every country, to confuse that with isolationism. We should be involved very much in diplomacy. We should be very much involved in trade, including cultural exchange. America, the more open America is, the more its kind of products and spirit will be accepted around the world. And I think the more peaceful the world will be. And we'll benefit from that. The whole point of, kind of capitalism and market exchanges is that when they're done willingly, every participant leaves better off than they were before the deal. They wouldn't make it. We should be selling more things to the world, buying more things from the world. We should be, sharing our culture and our values with the world, not at the point of a bayonet, but at the, via Netflix and Amazon, via, business, via commerce, via travel and migration. These are the ways to engage the world and make it better and safer and more peaceful.
Well, there's a modern blueprint for that. We did it in China. People, it's easy to cast China as an evil dictatorship, and frankly, they are. I mean, their government's completely fucked. But over the last 30 years, China's gone from a place of where their major cities were failing because of labor shortages. Like during the Chinese New Year, everybody leaves, right, for about a month, 2 to 3 weeks. And when they all come back, about 40% of the workforce doesn't return from the hinterland, right? That got worse. It wasn't quite so bad before, but it got worse as they saw neighboring countries who were also heavily involved in manufacturing, paying people living wages and things like that. Yeah. China has improved dramatically over the past 20 years. And the treatment of workers and the pay of workers and all that stuff. Now, they're still fucked. But the reason all that happened is because of pressure put on them by not just the American government, but by the purchasing power of the American citizenry.
Bringing them into the global economy, and it's, there are issues, to be sure, some of what you mentioned, and also the way that they are kind of one-sided in a lot of their trade. But by bringing them into the global economy, we raise the living standards of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, and make it less likely that they're going to invade or, become bellicose in their region, even if they're rattling their sabers.
Yeah, we did more just by telling them, you have to do this for us to buy your products than we ever could have done with any war.
Right. Yeah. And, and it remains, there are certain types of pressure that we can apply. That pressure is more meaningful when we're engaged with them. We have more influence with China than we do with North Korea, partly because, we're actually actively engaged in trade and commerce and back and forth with China. I also think, I appreciate you being nuanced on that, because right now, China, Russia is once again our number one enemy, but people on both the right and the left are demonizing China completely, and even the Chinese people. And that kind of shows you how hard it is to have a nuanced discussion about how do you help people, how do you make the world better, not in a utopian way where it's like a magic eraser board where you just swipe everything clean and rebuild on it, but in the world we're in today. And I think, a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, that's, you engage people through commerce, through culture, through example, by allowing people to come here. One of the best things that we do to change the future of China is to have a lot of Chinese students and a lot of Chinese migrants come here. And they're like, wow, like when they go back to China, if they go back, they're going to be like, what, like I want to have the equivalent, of a middle-class life with all of its cultural freedoms that they have in America, and they'll work for it. I mean, and there's no question the Chinese government is repressive, is awful, is immoral. But that isn't the question. The question is, how do you make it less like that? And one of the ways is by, engaging with them.
Correct. Yeah. Liberty is a bell that simply cannot be unrung.
All right. Very good. Very good.
Well, thanks for coming today. We appreciate it. It's a very interesting conversation, elucidated a lot of points from the libertarian side, most of which I agree with. And not that should matter, but we appreciate you coming. Tell everybody where they can find you, where they can find your material work, et cetera.
So, everything I do is at reason.com. It shows up there one way or the other. So go to reason.com and you can Google Nick Gillespie. I'm also very active, too active on Twitter, at Nick Gillespie, all lowercase.
All right. Thanks a lot for coming. We'll see you guys next time. Until then, we'll see you in hell.